Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marie Beam, the new CEO of the Discovery Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first event in the 2024 Discovery Museum Speaker Series, Parenting in a Time of Insecurity, with Dr. Jean Beresin and Dr. Khadijah Watkins, both from the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds. Thank you for joining us for this important and very timely conversation. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. Q&A will be open throughout the event. Please submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many as possible. Please use the chat button for any technical questions for the webinar host. Closed captioning can be turned on and off at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we are recording tonight's presentation, and a thank you to our presenters for allowing us to do this. A link to the recording will be sent to all registrants once it's available, and we'll also send a resource list with any follow-up information our presenters reference during the talk. I'm pleased to extend a special thank you to our speaker series sponsors. Tonight's event is free of charge, thanks to the loyal support of Enterprise Bank and Sutherland Realty Group, along with the other sponsors shown here. Their support has made this 12th year of the Discovery Museum Speaker Series possible. And thank you, too, to those of you who made a donation when you registered for tonight's event. That's a big help in keeping this free of charge and open to all. This year's Speaker Series theme is Conversation, Understanding, Hope. We've chosen to host conversations on topics that can be challenging for families or anyone really to navigate. Our goal is that with the guidance of our informed and insightful speakers, we can all gain a better understanding of these issues, and through that, a more hopeful perspective on the future and our ability to navigate it. The upcoming events in the schedule are shown here, and registration for all of them is open now on our website. We have guests from across the country with us tonight, so I'd like to briefly introduce our museum and our work to those of you who may not know us. Discovery Museum works to support kids and families by providing play-based learning experiences that are rooted in science and nature. We create exhibits and programs that spark kids' natural creativity and curiosity and that make learning fun. In 2023, we were able to increase our impact to new underserved audiences, continue on our path toward carbon neutrality, and work with our community partners to better reflect and serve our diverse community of interests and lived experiences. This year, the 42nd anniversary of our founding, we are looking toward the future by asking, how can we best build on our expertise and the great work this organization has done to expand the depth and breadth of our impact? In a thoughtful and inclusive strategic planning process this year, voices from across our community will inform new ways we can deliver joyful learning experiences and opportunities for connection and conversation like this speaker series to even more kids and families. If you have ideas for us, please reach out. We would love to hear them. We are honored now to host Jean and Khadijah for tonight's important conversation. Let me introduce them both. First, Dr. Jean Beresin is Executive Director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Massachusetts General Hospital. He also serves as Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Senior Educator in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Mass General. Dr. Khadijah Watkins is Associate Director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Massachusetts General Hospital. She also serves as Interim Director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Residency Training Program of Mass General Hospital and McLean Hospital. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We are honored to have your expertise and insight on this really important and sort of pressing topic. I'm a parent myself, and the idea for this presentation came from one of our visitors at the museum who asked in a recent conversation, how can I help my kids understand the world when I can't understand it myself? And we found that so poignant and such an articulate way to call out what so many parents are feeling. So let's get going. What makes this a time of great insecurity? And what is it that has so many parents and caregivers feeling anxious and unsettled these days?
These you want to start?
Whoever would like to start, I'll leave it to you.
Well, I want to thank you for having us. I'm super excited to be here. I think this we could go talk about this question alone for the whole rest of the hour. There's so much that I think that has parents uncertain and unsettled. You know, there's so much unpredictability. There's so much that we don't have control over, whether it is obviously things that are happening around us, what our kids see and hear, who's sharing this information with us. So I think there's so much that has us uncertain and unsettled, which makes it really hard to have or even to begin thinking about having these conversations with our kids, which is also what makes it so important, because we want to be the ones that's kind of controlling the narrative, having these tough conversations, being the sounding board for them to ask questions, and really kind of feel reassured. I mean, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Just a tip. But so, you know, there are so many uncertainties. I mean, you know, think about it. And whether we're talking about preschoolers or school-age kids or middle or high school kids or even young adults, you can't turn on any media without hearing about the wars in the Middle East, in the Ukraine, about mass shootings, the post-football game mass shooting that we just sadly, you know, experienced. Questions about the economy, issues of racism and health and disparities, people of color, Black Lives Matter. You know, I can go on and on and on, but there's so many issues. And I think the important point in addressing them, and I could list a ton more, is that our kids will, you know, inevitably hear about them, whatever ages they are. Even the preschoolers will hear us as adults and as parents, as caregivers, talking about them, and they'll have lots and lots of questions. So I think it's super important for us to think developmentally and to find ways of answering their questions, determining what their questions are, but also learning how to talk with them about these uncertainties.
How do we address that lack of control over what our kids are hearing and receiving, and the fact that some of those messages may not be accurate or may not be up to date, current, well informed? You know, should we be sharing news about what's going on in the world with our kids first so that they're hearing it from us?
I mean, it depends on their age. And I think it starts with us having to accept that there is so much out there and there's so many platforms through which kids can get information. But it starts with really having these conversations on an ongoing basis, letting them know that we're here to kind of answer questions, be supportive, learn with them. Part of it is, you know, teaching them about media literacy, talking about what platforms are safe and what platforms give trusted information. How can they think about, you know, beginning to vet information on their own when they receive it. But it also starts with us knowing what they're looking at and where they're getting their information from. So we can't really intervene and help right the ship if we don't even know what they're hearing and where they're hearing it from. So we have to begin to have these conversations about, so what social media sites do you use? Who is telling you what? Are they talking about it in school? Or other people's parents talking about these things to you, so that we can begin to kind of know where their sources are and begin to kind of talk to them about it. But most importantly, you know, approaching this from a non-judgmental standpoint, again, an open standpoint, so they know that we can tolerate these conversations, that we're here to help and we're not afraid. But again, whether you share news or don't share news, I think it depends on the age. You know, older kids, you can definitely sit down and watch the news with them, watch the social media clips with them. But younger kids, you probably want to really limit it. In terms of what you expose them to. But and every kid is different, and parents are the expert on their kids and they know what their tolerance levels are. And so I think it engage that as well.
I can't agree more. The only other things that I would add to that is for kids of all ages, what they want to know is, am I safe? Are you the people taking care of me safe? And how will these uncertain events in the world affect my daily life? So those are generalizations. And then you address kids developmentally at different ages. But I think you have to start conversations early. And some principles of these conversations are began first by asking questions. Are there things you're worried about? What are you afraid of? What are your major concerns? Um, uh, that's a starter. And validate their feelings, because all their feelings and concerns are right, even if they're worried that they've heard that there's a war and that there's bombings going on, and are we going to be bombed? Young children don't know how far away the Middle East is or the Ukraine is from Acton, So we need to ask what they're worried about. We need to listen to them, validate their feelings, share our own anxieties. One important thing is when you're having these conversations, and we can talk about how you address preschoolers, school-age kids, middle school, high school, and young adults, and the differences. The first step, I think, is to control your own anxiety. I mean, we're all anxious. I mean, everybody is anxious. And when the flight attendant says, if the pressure drops, put the oxygen mask on yourself first and then help the person next to you, we need to put our oxygen masks on ourselves in order to help our kids. And research has shown that no matter what age the kid is, or young adult is, when a caregiver or parent is in control of their anxiety, at least in control of it, or acknowledges that they're anxious, and we can talk about how we can control our own anxiety, we're in a far better position to address their concerns and address them in a coherent fashion. And if we don't know the answers, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, I'm worried. And I have ways of dealing with that. And then let them ask you, well, how do you deal with this?
And controlling your own anxiety is also really important, because kids, inherently don't want to upset. I mean, I know it seems strange because sometimes they do seem like they push our buttons, but inherently they don't want to upset parents, and they don't want to feel that they're bringing something to you that is going to really dysregulate you. And so if they see that they don't think that you can tolerate their emotions or what they're talking about, it's really going to quickly shut down those conversations, and they're going to be hesitant to revisit these things with you in the future. And that's absolutely not what we want. We want to, again, always kind of keep this open door policy. We want to make sure they know that we can tolerate what they bring to the table. And it's okay for us to say that we're anxious, we're afraid, or we don't know too. That's really important to be honest with them. But we have to be able to be in control in that space as well.
Yeah, there's nothing scarier for a kid to hear something that's dishonest. Oh, I'm not anxious. Well, then they know you're hiding, then they know you're hiding something. But one of the ways of our controlling anxiety is self-care. And I think that's an important, in times of uncertainty, I think both parents and kids of all ages need to practice means of self-care. And that means getting good night's sleep, turning the screens off at night, because blue screens actually keep you awake, good exercise, diet and nutrition, meditation, yoga, and doing many of these activities with your kids to take care of ourselves is incredibly important, because it's one of the primary ways that we become resilient, and it's one of the primary ways that we actually can kind of calm the whole system down, and then be in a position to address what the questions, what the comments, what the concerns are, and what's going on with our kids.
I've done a little bit of reading about it on another talk that you both gave, and you had some really wonderful definitions of self-care that were different than what I think we commonly hear, which can feel overwhelming or like too much, or I can't possibly make time to exercise, I'm so busy. Can you talk a little bit about some of those small and easier ideas that adults can model for their kids around taking care of themselves?
I mean, those are really common myths and misconceptions that self-care is time consuming, that it is expensive, it's a luxury. And I think really, again, having conversations like these to say that you can engage in self-care for 5 minutes, you can do a 5-minute meditation. I think what is important though, that it has to be deliberate, just like anything else that we want to do and do consistently, we have to make time for it and we have to be deliberate and make it part of our daily routine and habit. And so, if it becomes optional, like so many things, when we're crunched for time, we say, we'll come back to that. We'll do that tomorrow. Self-care is one of these things that we should think about as integral to our health. But we can take 5 minutes to meditate or deep breathe. Whatever really recharges you or refuels you. Some people don't like those things. It makes them more anxious or makes them uncomfortable. So it really is about finding what works for you. Gina, there are other things. There's so many things that you can do in a quick
Well, sure.
few
I mean,
minutes.
I'm sure there, for example, having social supports, reaching out to trusted family members, partners, spouses, parents, grandparents, if they're around, is super important. Taking time to set priorities. We as parents and caregivers can't do everything. And setting up what our priorities are. Another thing that's really important in terms of helping to keep things under control is providing structure. Structure at home, just as structure at school, the structure at the Discovery Museum. The kids need and thrive on structure, and if everything seems and is under control, then we'll all be in a position to have these kind of conversations, without intrusion. So I would think about and other things, for example, like use of creative arts. I mean, what's helpful for both teenagers, young adults, school-age kids, and parents and caregivers is journaling, is singing, is music, creating playlists, listening to music. There's a wealth of creative arts that we can use and we can do together. They really do make a difference. I mean, I remember when we were under lockdown for the pandemic, one of the first things my family did was create a family Spotify playlist. And everybody in the family, including the kids, my grandchildren, contributed a tune. And it was really amazing because everybody felt that they were contributing. And speaking of contributing, finally, I think what's super important under uncertain times is making a contribution, because our brains are wired, because we're pack animals and we need each other. And when we give, the brain is stimulated more than when we receive, because it releases oxytocin, which is the chemical that connects us all together. So making a contribution, whether that's making a meal for, someone who's, having a difficult time in the community, or whether that's lighting a candle for somebody, or whether it's writing a get well card for someone who's ill, or think of any way that you and your kids can make a contribution, locally, nationally, you name it. It will help you feel better about yourself and that you're actually doing something to help others. And that is incredibly reassuring, and it helps self-care.
And the other thing about self-care, I think that is also kind of we take for granted is just really taking care of our basic needs, like making sure that we eat regular meals, eat healthy portions, healthy diet, making sure that we get enough sleep, and that we're exercising. But other things like, connected to nature, taking a walk, or just kind of observing nature, taking a few minutes for gratitude and reflection. Like all of these things can be done really quickly, but we just have to make sure that we are being deliberate about it, making sure that we make it a priority among the things that we kind of have to do, just like we have to, drink enough fluids and eat enough. We have to make sure we take care of ourselves.
Well, and it sounds like for those of us that are parents and caregivers, if we find it hard to do those things just for ourselves, knowing that modeling them is going to have an impact on our kids, and the kids in our care, maybe that would be an extra motivation that can sort of get us over the hump with this. Um,
And these things can be fun to do together, which I think Jean mentioned, like how we create playlists together. We might do exercise together, do a walk together. So while we're modeling, we can also do it with them and kind of practice with them as well.
that's great.
And I'd add one other additional thing that's very important is that to help calm everybody down is use narratives. Storytelling has been an incredible, powerful force. Think of all of the great religions in the world, and whether it's with the Quran or the Torah or the Bible, you name it, narratives have always been meaning making, and bedtime stories,
Mm.
fairy tales, but family narratives are especially important. And I remember when my mom, who died at 102-ish, my kids would always say to her, you know, Gamma, tell us the story of the Great Depression. And she would tell them how she was a concert pianist, and she would play. I mean, she was hit. They were the whole in New York, it was pretty rough. And she would play the piano in department stores for change, and got through it. And the same thing is true for family narratives. When did we have a hard time? Remember when the tree fell on the house? Remember when the pipes broke in the basement? Remember when we had all that snow or ice? And helping kids see that even under the most adverse situations, we can get through it, we can manage it despite adversity.
Hmm.
That generates hope.
That's great. We had a fantastic speaker series presentation a couple years ago that was all about storytelling as a tool to help kids, feel more in control of their world. And we'll share the recording for that in the follow-up materials. Thank you both. It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is really rooted in sort of connection with kids and leaving space and offering time for these conversations. But it occurs to me also in listening to you, we are working hard, all of us, to raise kids who are empathetic and right and thinking about the well-being of others and invested in their community, and even some of those service and sort of philanthropic acts that you mentioned, Jean, are really about empathy. But empathy also is part of what triggers some of this anxiety. Is that true? And how do we balance a message about caring with maybe a counterbalancing message about you can't care about everything all at once. You can't feel responsible for everything all at once.
Well, a lot of that depends on the temperament of your kids. I mean, some kids feel so burdened that they have to basically tackle all the problems. And they don't. And we have to let them know that, for example, if they're worried about climate change, we're not going to change the Arctic, from melting.
Yes.
But what we can do is we can work on advocating for solar energy in our community. We can recycle. We can do small things that overall, if everybody did something really small, and then I would just ask the kids, what if every kid did fill in the blank, how would that help the planet? How would that help a planet that you're worried about inheriting, which is pretty scary right now? And, so helping them see the big picture, but they really can't take it all on, and they feel overwhelmed. I mean, if, you know, you know, it's like asking, how can we stop hate crimes? How can we stop racism? How can we stop, all sorts of disparities? If the kids feel that it's their responsibility to tackle these monumental problems, I would encourage us to kind of think about and ask them and discuss, what can you do in your own world, with your own friends, in your own community, to help chip away at this problem? And what can you do to help encourage others to do the same?
And I think to add to that, it's also teaching our kids awareness about themselves and their body so that they know when they are taking too much on. And again, going back to teaching them and modeling for them coping skills. When have I seen too much? When have I taken on too much? And what can I do to kind of help rebalance myself is really important, because sometimes they just don't know. All of a sudden I'm not sleeping. All of a sudden my appetite has changed, and not really knowing that this is a sign maybe of anxiety or depression. So really helping them to become more self-aware about their bodies and how they feel, so that they know when they need to take a step back and a pause.
What about kids who are not really willing to engage in this conversation? You know that they know what's going on, maybe older kids, teens or tweens, who are connected and are well aware of concerning news, but are not willing to discuss it. How can you draw that out of them over time?
I just say you keep having conversations. Maybe you're not having a long
Got it.
conversations, but I think you just keep talking to them, because what we do know, young kids and older kids alike, what they will concoct in their imagination is far worse than what the reality often is. And so we do need to kind of help them think about what's going on, how we're keeping them safe, even if they're not, asking these questions. We know our kids, we know kind of, sort of, some of the things that they're thinking, some of the things they might be afraid of, but I would say just keep at it and let them know that you're here and that you're thinking about it, you're thinking about them. And you might be surprised, maybe they might say 2 or 3 words every now and then. So in those cracks, when you're on the way to school or on the way to the grocery store, I don't know if kids go with parents to the grocery stores anymore, but whatever these things that you guys are doing together, like these are opportunities to have little mini conversations.
And I'd add to that, particularly for the younger kids and the school age kids, playing with them, drawing with them. You know, younger children work things out through play, and oftentimes it's repetitive play. And sometimes you think, being a first responder over and over and over again is not very healthy, but actually repetition helps them work it through. So if they've heard about a mass shooting and they're playing a game, play with them, and try to ask them what's going on during the play. I mean, use play in the service of making a connection, of understanding what they're thinking, of asking them what's going on, and enter that world. Because entering the world of play, particularly for preschoolers and young school-age kids and older school-age kids, it's really super important. And for adolescents, as Khadijah mentioned before, there's no, social media is something we got to talk about, but finding out what they're using for their apps, looking at the news with them, stopping it and saying, what do you think was going on here? How would you understand that? What would you do differently? What would you recommend? Having some kind of a nuance with teenagers and young adults, the conversations can become more and more nuanced. And that's so I would turn the media off for the younger kids, because it's going to be overwhelming and they're going to get scared. For the adolescents and young adults, I would say engage in the media with them. And unfortunately, few parents actually and caregivers actually do this. But this is something I think that's worth taking a little time to do, particularly when they're really scary and upsetting events like the recent shooting, in Kansas City.
And I would just say, back to kids who maybe don't necessarily want to talk, they are listening. And my son has mastered this art of pretending to not listen, and then he'll bring things up that we have talked about or that I have said to, in my mind, maybe to deaf ears, but he's listening. And in that same vein, they're listening to what we say to each other and to what we say on the phone and to what we maybe say, on some of these calls. So just be mindful that they are listening. And so we have to be thoughtful about that, especially even when we think that they're not.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear your thoughts on a topic that I think is particularly complicated. why why do we see young kids sometimes and teens acting out in hateful ways in response to these messages? You know, even when their actions are so contradictory to the values we model inside our home.
Oh, it's a very complicated question. I mean, first of all, it depends on a number of things. But what, so for example, it could be that they're doing it to bring to your attention um, that they're troubled by something and that they want you to intervene. So when kids steal, or when kids are destructive, or when kids are acting in hateful ways, it's often a cry for help. And they often want you to intervene and help become more involved in their lives. Another possibility, which we need to really investigate more, is the copycat phenomenon. We know pretty well for sure that when there's a suicide that's depicted either with a celebrity, whether it's Kate Spade or Kurt Cobain or Robin Williams, you name it, or a fictional character, that there's a 2-week period in which adolescents will copy that behavior. And there's been more and more research about copycat homicides and about copycat hateful behavior. So we need more research on it, but I think that's another possibility. And sometimes it's an expression of just anger or rage. And sometimes that anger or rage, what's underlying it, is that they've been victimized. So, for example, another possibility, and there are many of them, but I'm just throwing out some of the most common ones. If they've been victims of bullying, if they've been victims of disparities, one reaction is to take action in exactly the same way as the victimizer and become that person to deal with that situation, even though it's not a very healthy way of dealing with it.
There's another group I think that is also vulnerable are kids who maybe don't fit in and they're looking for a group of people who maybe think a certain way. So they might do things to fit in with a group to try to feel a sense of community and belonging. So I think there are some kids who fall into that a little bit different from a copycat, but the sense of really trying to be part of a group, especially for kids at this stage of life, belonging, community, being accepted is really, really important to them. How their peers feel about them is really, really highly valued. And so sometimes we do see kids do things to try to fit into a group.
And sometimes kids with very low self-esteem, or who have underlying issues with anger and upset and or kind of a self-loathing, will act in a hateful way as an expression of what they're feeling underneath. Now, I'm not suggesting that we as parents and caregivers try to become shrinks, because we're not, and in my life, I've never played that role with my kids or my grandchildren. On the other hand, I think what's important is for all of us to be thinking of, the 3 W's, and that's kind of a motto of the Clay Center, and that is, if you know what to look for, when to worry, and what to do, you'll be in a better position to kind of help generate some hypotheses about what might be going on, and then you can explore those things.
This is so helpful. I appreciate the you're giving us both sort of broad brush philosophies on these things, but also some incredibly actionable ideas. On that side, we have a question from one of our viewers about war or sort of aggression-based games, whether it be games that involve, real life in-person games that involve shooting, whether it be video games or sort of reenactment sort of things. Is this a way for kids to process their feelings about aggression, or is this a way for us to encourage more aggression and sort of aggressive response in our kids?
We've done some research on violent video games, and despite what some people argue that violent video games cause violence, there's absolutely no evidence that there's a causal relationship between watching violent video games or playing them, or violent movies for that matter, and it causing violent behavior, except there's about a 5%. If for example, a boy, and this is more typical for males and females, has trait aggression, that they're basically aggressive kids, and they may have, some underlying psychiatric or mental health condition that makes them, angrier or more volatile, or that they can't tell the difference between reality and non-reality. That small percent, now 5% is, in the big scheme of things, not that small, but if it's your kid, it can actually fire them up. And so one of the things I think that the moral of the story is, know your kids. I mean, most of the kids that watch Wile E. Coyote getting, knocked on the head.
Do they know who Wile E. Coyote is?
Well, but the Three Stooges. I grew up with the Three Stooges. Okay, so most people know who the Three Stooges are. But when I used to go to the local matinees when I was growing up to watch the Three Stooges and Looney Tunes, people would come out and they would act like the Three Stooges, but every kid didn't hit another kid over the head with a frying pan. Okay, so but there are some people that believe that violent video games beget violence, and for most kids, they don't. Now, that being said, as parents, we need to know what the content of the games are. We need to know what the content of the movies are, and we need to know the temperament of our kids. I mean, you are the experts in your children. So, for example, a girl who might be anxious or shy or shell-shocked, like my granddaughter, couldn't watch commercials during the Super Bowl because they were too loud and aggressive, and she would run out of the room. Watching, even Walt Disney, there are plenty of very scary aspects and misogynistic aspects to Disney films, where, in The Lion King, where Simba watches his uncle murder his father into caribous. My kids couldn't tolerate that. In fact, they weren't allowed to see it because the parents saw it. The moral of the story is this: if you don't know what games your kids are playing, if you don't know what movies they are, find out. And then go to a site like Common Sense Media, which has wonderful, wonderful reviews of films, video games, books, and actually describes to you what the different episodes are, and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And it's a really valuable resource. But we need to know what our kids are doing, and and you find out, and then you go to a resource and check it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You referenced earlier, Jean, adults who don't act like grown-ups, and we seem to be increasingly surrounded by poor examples of mature and polite behavior, respectful behavior, good sportsmanship, and so forth. How should we talk to our kids and the kids in our lives about that? How can we combat that message that there are a lot of people out there who are sort of doing whatever they want and not worrying about how it impacts others?
I mean, I think we just have to have those conversations. We have to have the conversations when we see it, call it out. Like, this is not okay to say this to someone. It's not okay to speak to someone this way. it's not okay to behave in this way. It's also important to have them, again, see us model healthy relationships, us model how we have healthy ways in which we disagree with one another, you know, teach them what the general ingredients are of healthy relationships. So, you know, there's trust, there's mutual respect, there's tolerance of differences. There is a tolerance for us to be able to disagree, but not, you know, not any longer love each other. Like we still love each other even though we disagree. And to be able to model that for them is really, really, really important. And I think even more important now because we see the opposite. But in the same token, also let them know what unhealthy relationships look like. You know, when you feel unsafe, when you feel there's a lack of reciprocity, when you don't feel respected or that your opinion is valued, when you feel taken advantage of. And again, modeling how do you, you know, have these conversations about unhealthy relationships? How do you get out of unhealthy relationships? It's also so super important, but you know, really the idea of being able to resolve conflict in a really healthy way is important for us to be able to talk about with our kids and demonstrate with them. Even, you know, we talk about at the Play Center how we can role play some of these things. It's really important.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that we've seen among some of our, and I won't name names, because I don't want to get too political here, but oftentimes there, you know, there's a lot of conflict. And as Khadijah was just saying, what we're not seeing is conflict resolution. And there are four elements about conflict resolution. The first one is appreciating the differences. And that's having a conversation with your kid about what the opposing points of view are. The second is acceptance of differences. And that means being able to put yourself in the shoes of the person with of another person that has a different point of view, and to understand what those different points of view are. The third element is tolerance, and that means being able to you know uh, uh, understand why, and this involves empathy, a person might feel so different than you or somebody else. And finally, there's the resolution part of it. And resolution doesn't necessarily mean we're all going to kind of like, hug each other and sail off into the sunset in agreement. I mean, we can agree to disagree and still love and respect each other. Those four elements are generally not demonstrated by many of our role models these days. And I think we as parents and caregivers need to kind of counter what kids are seeing in the schoolyard, on TV, in the news, and try to help them understand what those conflicts are and how to resolve them. And another whole issue is that's related is helping to teach them how to have civil conversations, because screaming at each other, as we've seen a number of times on television, whether it's in a movie or whether it's in the news, is not appropriate, and we don't want them to do that. So we need to really kind of help them understand how to engage in civil conversations, and I think it begins at home.
And back to, I think I said this earlier, like our kids are watching, they're listening. And so, when we have these kind of uncivil conversations, or when we're all human, when we, lose it and we flip our lid, how do we also demonstrate to them, how do we, recognize that we were wrong? How do we recover? How do we repair? How do we apologize and make amends? I think is also equally important, because we are human and we do make mistakes. It shouldn't be a regular occurrence, but, again, demonstrating for them, how do we kind of recover from these errors in our ways.
Yeah. An admission of imperfection from a parent can go a long way, right?
Right.
Well, one of my favorite psychiatrists of all times is Donald Winnicott. And one of the things he said was, as and he was talking about both parents and therapists, that we succeed by our failures. I mean, and I think modeling that for our kids and our kid, because let's face it, if everything that we or our kids did went perfect, 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 we never learn anything, So what we can learn from is our failures, our mishaps, our mistakes, and then learn what led to it, learn, you know, um, how to understand it. And as Khadijah said, the power of apology is just awesome. We have to teach our kids how to not just live by the golden rule, but when you mess up, you've got to do something about it. You can't just leave it unresolved. And apology and making reparations is a huge and powerful force that we can teach them.
Wouldn't that be a gift to the world if we could create a generation that's better at that than we are, huh? We
Definitely.
have a question from an audience member. What are some specific strategies for age-appropriate communication of parent mental health symptoms and challenges in real time in a way that doesn't shame or overburden the children?
It depends on the age of the. We're talking about a parent that has mental health symptoms. Is that?
That is my understanding there, yes.
Okay.
How does one talk about how do we talk about our own mental health symptoms?
Well, I think, again, we got to think about this developmentally. I mean, preschoolers and young school age children won't really understand the same way a middle school or a high school or young adult would. So one of the things we need to do is think developmentally. But I think, for example, the Gen Zs, 12 to 24 right now, will really appreciate our speaking about mental health symptoms the same way we would speak about the fact that we have asthma or diabetes or migraines or things that we can talk about that aren't stigmatized. And the good news about there's good news and there's bad news about the Gen Zs. I mean, the bad news is it's the loneliest generation ever, and that's a real serious concern that was brought out by the Surgeon General. On the other hand, they happen to be one of the most open, progressive, and thoughtful generation that actually does understand mental health symptoms, where you can talk about depression, anxiety, stress, suicide in meaningful ways, and have a discussion about that, and it destigmatizes it. It normalizes it. The fact is that during the course of a lifetime, 1 out of 2 individuals will have a psychiatric disorder. Now, at any one point in time, 1 out of 4 will. The good news about our being parents and caregivers and dealing with kids is that 50% begin before age 14 and 75% begin before age 26. So it gives us an opportunity to start talking about anxiety, depression, stress, loneliness, bullying, trauma, in ways that developmentally kids can understand them, and to bring it out of the closet, because frankly, mental health problems are more common than strep throat. That's a fact.
And I think we have to think about this from the standpoint of that we're trying to really get away from thinking about this in a way that how do we talk about our mental health issues versus our physical issues? Like they're all health issues and concerns. And so in the same way that we would talk about it with the child, what's the function of us sharing this information? What do our kids want to know? They want to still know the same 3 things that Jean said earlier. Am I safe? Are you safe? And how is this going to affect my life? And so how we share the information to the degree that we kind of answer these questions, if that makes sense, so that we don't overburden them. They don't need to know the details about our treatment or about what we're struggling or suffering with, but that maybe I'm a little bit sad or maybe I'm a little bit nervous. And again, also depending on the age of the child and the temperament of the child, because you know your child better than anyone else, like what they can tolerate, what would be soothing and reassuring to them, and what would make them more anxious. And you tell them, you know, with that in that vein, with that in mind. I think that's the way I would say it.
Yeah, yeah. So we what do you think is really at the root of this? We are all more anxious. Is there more going on in the world that is anxiety provoking? Are we just more aware of it? Has it invaded our lives and in deeper and more personal ways? It feels like a very hard time to be a parent. And did other generations have this same experience and perhaps process it differently? Could you give us a little context for this?
I mean, I definitely think it's invading our lives differently than it did before. Like when I would go home from school, like I'd be done with school, other than my homework. Like I didn't have to have, my friends follow me into my house and me, being acutely aware of everything that they were doing, everything that I was left out of that they were doing, everything that's going on in all parts of the world, in the same way that these kids are now inundated. And again, the other tricky thing is whether you want to or not. So I could be on social media and I'm not looking for certain things, but they pop up in my feed and I may not be prepared to see them. And so, me being an adult, I can check to see I've had too much today. So I'm gonna clock out, and I don't have the fear of missing out or being excluded because I have other ways that I've developed to connect and relate to people who I care about or who are important to me. Whereas I think today this is a main line for a lot of young people to connect. And so they are also not acutely aware of what's going on in their body and how they're feeling when they're on social media enough to the point where they can say, I've had too much today, I need to take a break. Or I'm only gonna, I'm gonna limit it to these points of time during the day because I've noticed when I do it more than this, I feel anxious, I feel sad, I feel depressed. And I think it's really that awareness, I think is that moderation that kids don't have. And I think it's just the inundation of so many things. You could scroll and keep scrolling and you never hit the bottom. And so I think the way that we are inundated and exposed in a way is so much different. That gives us so much more angst because we have so much more information to digest and process, and now have to share this to our kids in developmentally appropriate ways is huge in the way that we didn't have to do before.
Yeah, I agree. I think social media has made a huge difference. I mean, we're all digital hostages. As I look around my room, I have an iPhone, an iPad, I have a computer, I have a computer screen. I mean, we're but I think blaming social media on why there's been since the early to mid 2000s an escalation in depression, anxiety, stress, suicide, uh, as well as suicidal thinking, and loneliness. It was way pre-COVID. And social media always is kind of like the number one to blame. And it does play a role in this. Although for some kids, social media is a godsend. For kids who are on the autistic spectrum disorder or who are super anxious or fearful or shy, using digital media to communicate is extraordinarily helpful. But there are other things I think that are also important, and that is that increasingly, certainly since the early 2000s, but prior to that, our kids are overscheduled. I mean, they have to get A's, they have to take AP courses, they have to do community service, they have to do service learning, they have to do an internship, they have to play 2 or 3 sports. They have to play violin, they have to play Suzuki violin, they have to kind of go to concerts, they have to, get a job or get an internship. And, kids today
and have a social life.
and have a social life, but they have no time. In fact, that's one of the major reasons for loneliness is because they have no time to actually just hang out with their kids the way things were many, many, many years ago. And so, this incredible pressure cooker that we're putting on our kids, if you compare it, say, to say Finland, that has some of the highest standardized scores in the world, they do 3.5 hours of academics a day and no homework. What they have in the interim are social and social emotional learning and group activities and and other collective activities, such that they really have the time to learn social emotional skills, interpersonal skills, connecting with each other, and process what's been going on. So I think it's a huge burden, and we have to really look at our educational system and the cultural forces that are making our kids overscheduled as a major force. And I think the other thing that's happening is that since the 2000s, with the advent of multimedia everywhere and every place, is the awareness of a number, and the stuff that gets in the news is usually the sensational stuff, a shooting, some, a sexual assault, you name it. There's nothing more scary, I think, than the local news, because what do you see in the local news? You see break-ins, you see robberies, you see all kinds of dangerous things happening, and our kids are not oblivious to this. So there are multiple forces that are making our kids more anxious, depressed, lonely, and suicidal. And we need to, I think, be aware of that, limit media, talk with them, and start very, very early about what they're worried about, what their concerns are, and keep the conversations going.
Right. That's great. I have one final question for you, with our thanks, and this is I think hopefully a nice way to wrap up. We've talked a lot about controlling the negative messages that come in, and how much really is wrong in the world. But do you also think that we under-celebrate the things that are good and joyful and happy and show possibility and hope for the future? Your thoughts, please.
I mean, absolutely. Because I think, like to Jean's point, what gets sensationalized, like the scary things, the negative things. And I think, making sure that we take time out to celebrate the positive, taking time out to think about gratitude and what we're grateful for, what we're thankful for is really important. And I really think that could be helpful to incorporate some of these things into your daily life, your daily activity. These are things you can do around the dinner table, you can do at breakfast. But again, these little moments that just take a couple of minutes. What are you thankful for? What are you looking forward to? What went well today? Who helped you today? Can just be really great ways to have conversations, to think about, some of the positive things that are happening, like right to us directly.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And I think that the good news about Gen Z, despite, the escalation of depression, anxiety, stress, loneliness, suicide, is that this generation, 12 to 24-ish, has never been, since the 60s, more globally conscious, more aware of disparities in the world, more concerned about the planet, more concerned about gun control, about mass shootings, about disparities due to race, LGBTQIA. There's a greater awareness of these issues and an ability to talk about it in ways that I think are incredibly powerful. And even though many of them are the source of their dark side, the fact that they can talk about this and do talk about this and are activists, many of our younger kids of our school age, middle school, high school, and young adults, are engaged in some form of activism, which I think is quite healthy and good for kids, provided that they do it in a thoughtful, nonviolent, and respectful manner.
This is wonderful. It's a great note to end on. Your timing is impeccable. Jean, Khadijah, I thank you so very much on behalf of the Discovery Museum for joining us. We really value our connection to the Clay Center. This is an incredible resource for folks near and far. And so please, if you've been watching in the chat, a lot of links to the Clay Center's works and resources have been shared. We will send resources in a list out to everyone along with the recording. We hope to see you next time, Jean and Khadijah. Thank you again for everything tonight. Good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.